Hello and welcome there to another episode of the Cliff Notes podcast, where we ask a leader and find a way. My name's Tristan Bailey, the host of the show and agency owner at Holding Bay. Today I've been joined by Hamlyn Williams as the historian and author of How Britain Shaped the Manufacturing World. Hello again today, Philip.
Hello, Tristan. Good to hear you.
Indeed. Nice to catch up with you. We've been being able to get stuck into your great history book, and definitely a passion area of mine too, of Britain manufacturing and this changing period of time. But what brought you to writing a history book or covering this subject?
Okay, well, I really stumbled across an amazing archive that my dad had left. His job in World War II was to supply the army with everything it needed apart from food and fuel. And in fact, it was my mum who kept some remarkable albums. So I had a lot of material to work from. I then just dug and found more and more about how the army was supplied and who supplied it. And an awful lot was done by the motor industry, which I loved anyway. So it was that really inspired me to dig deeper into our manufacturing history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I think it's a fascinating period. I certainly studied around, and I mean, just a preset for the people who aren't looking at the book like I am at the minute. So the book is covers a period of roughly about 100 years, but there is some other pieces that cover sort of the lead up to this time, the period between the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace, and then the 100 years that rolled into 1951 of the Festival of Britain, and so much sort of change and innovation and hard work and in so many areas that changed the shape of this country. That the book relays that in a detail of the sort of foundation of the British Isles and the citizens who sort of were both raised up and raised each other up with these sort of improvements, and left that legacy to spread around the world, and moving us as sort of British Isles from empire into industry, as we drove sort of trade and innovation around the world. I mean, that's the sort of where was the message that you're trying to find in that, or it was just all those little stories within there that made the change?
Well, I think that the broad thrust of it is exactly what you have. The Great Exhibition, I think, was a wonderful way to look at the subject. My great-grandfather exhibited there. He made surgical instruments at a business in the Strand in London. And he took on the role of secretary to the group of surgical instrument makers at the Great Exhibition. So I got hold of a catalogue, and reading through that catalogue, you see name after name that you recognise. You know, the incredible spread of businesses around that mid-19th century time. And it just made me want to look back to where they'd come from. But then, of course, to look forward to where they all went.
Indeed. I mean, pulling out quote from the book of those skilled and imaginative men who explored new and different ways to make things. It's sort of a great visions or lens on it. It's sort of they shined what was possible, but I think some of the things that they were demonstrating were only just possible, or were still theories in some ways, weren't they? They weren't necessarily massively scaled as we might think of them today. They're still early stages of many of the innovation, many of the sort of mechanized vehicles and automation around the helm.
Absolutely. 1851, we had steam trains. And that was important, not least for getting the thousands of people to come to the exhibition. But of course, no one had dreamt of the internal combustion engine at that time. Most ships then were powered by sail. It was only later that steam came into ships. And of course, electricity Yes, of course, we knew what electricity was and some of what it could do. But at that time, it was communication. It was the telegraph that electricity was used for.
And a distance and the concept of sort of moving away and moving around were still foreign for many people, or many people in their day-to-day lives. They went off on package holidays around the world, and they were hard at work, and you got to get that stuff innovated before it's possible.
Absolutely. I think the focus of the beginning of the story is one all tied up with shipping and trade, but also textiles. As an island nation, we'd been weaving textiles for centuries. And of course, as an island nation, we got on ships and we went overseas to trade. And one of those things that we traded were cotton goods, which we discovered being made in places like India. They were brought back and much loved by the wealthy of the British nation. But those clever guys up in the northwest thought, well, we could actually do rather better if we wove that stuff ourselves and just imported the raw cotton. And so they imported the raw cotton in bulk. And that cotton industry in the Northwest began. And of course, that's where an awful lot of the innovation came in. Guys actually working in weaving and spinning, but thinking of better ways and quicker ways of doing it. All the time people were exploring the possibilities.
Sponsorship of this podcast has been brought to you by Holding Bay, the digital web agency. Holding Bay specialises in working with B2B companies like manufacturers to build better solutions and drive better sales funnels. So if you would like to build a web application or improve your branding and sales funnel, get in contact today. holdingbay.co.uk or call us on 01273 044 019.
Down the coal mines, how do you get rid of all that water? And that's where the steam engine came in. How do you ventilate? How do you get the coal to the surface? Having got it to the surface, how do you get it to the customer? All these little challenges along the way presented opportunities for these inventive people to come up with their ideas.
And did you just get a sense from your research that that was just of the time, and people were being inventive? There was things that were within sight or within reach that people were thinking to invent at the time, or were challenged to invent, or do you feel that maybe there was something different about England, of where we were, or where we're a small island, and just by the necessity of bumping up against other things, or the friction, there was enough friction to require the change?
I think friction is actually a really good point. It's both friction and opportunity. In a sense, had it not been for cotton and the mass production of cotton, we probably wouldn't have moved very far or very fast at all. But having started the cotton industry, and with the Napoleonic Wars suffering a massive crash in prices, the challenge was, well, how do we produce this stuff more cheaply? And of course, it's the same story as today. You mechanize. You find different ways of doing it. You find different sources of power. To begin with, it was water, it was animals. But then we came up with steam and what discovered how steam could power a rotary motion. And all that powered this industry and really upscaled what could be done.
And I mean, do you think from the sense, because a lot of your quotes and references are around sort of perceivably sort of small companies or small innovations that then got scaled up. Do you see that these were people who were looking in that global sense, or they were solving local problems, but the market that would allow them to sell more widely afterwards allowed that innovation or the other companies to come in and try and work on that, and make it move faster.
Yeah, I think those inventive guys were solving the immediate local problems. But then you had a different bunch of people with, if you like, a broader vision. And here I'd bring in one of my heroes, Joseph Ruston, who set up business in Lincoln, making steam engines and steam pumps. And there's a story of him going out to Russia to with his steam pumps to drain acre after acre of land so it could be planted. And while he was there, he heard that a guy had discovered oil, and they needed a way to extract it. So off he went with his diagrams of steam pumps, and he sold pumps to extract oil. This is a man taking advantage of opportunity. He not only could see the technicalities of his pumps, but he could see their applications and their broader applications.
And is that what comes up over and again? Is people were innovating in one way, and either they then had to diversify through competition or change in market, or someone else saw that and realised what they could do with it in a different field.
Yeah, I think you have various models. If we look at the motor car, which of course the British did not were not first in the field. The Red Flag Act prevented that. And of course, the red flag was there because steam vehicles on roads were thought to be so dangerous. So the red flag restricted the field of anything actually going on the roads. But as soon as the British could make motor cars, they did. And here you get the entrepreneurs. Harry Lawson got the license to build to Daimler's design, and he set up a factory in Coventry in an old cotton mill. And that really was the first motor car factory. But alongside him, as a total entrepreneur, you have people like Lanchester, who was a total engineer. Lanchester did just about everything. Interestingly, in a review of one of his first vehicles, it was described really as the first motor car. The other vehicles were engines attached to carriages, but Lanchester actually produced a vehicle that performed in every real sense like a motor car. They were all looking at opportunities and addressing issues.
And do you feel that this innovation had sort of delayed enough, or had come late enough that people they were seeing the need or the advantage of the motor vehicle, or there was still enough friction that they've got to work extra hard to get that through and get people to accept these new technologies? Because so much of this stuff is still going to be change, even if it is an opportunity for people, or people were more excited for change at that point.
I think that this is where the war's coming in, and the wars are both tragic and crucial. I think that you could strongly argue that the First World War provided a huge impetus to the development of the motor vehicle, both the wheeled vehicle on land, but of course the motor vehicle in the air, the aeroplane, but also oil-powered ships. It was a period, of horror, but also huge development.
Mm-hmm. And huge displacement and change too, either for the very tragic loss of life of therefore you've lost some of your workforce afterwards, or even during, to be able to compete with it. So sort of change of structure of how people were interacting with things, or which women going to work a bit more and things like this, that that's going to have encouraged people to innovate in a different way that weren't before as well. So sort of a side effect of that.
That's right. I think during the First World War, you found working conditions improving really dramatically, and that was largely because women joined the workforce. But there were other things. If we think back to 1914, we had a massive shipbuilding industry that was superb. We had wonderful railway trains, steam railway trains. But what we didn't have was much in the way of an armaments industry. The Royal Arsenal down at Woolwich produced ammunition sufficient, really, for the army to defend the borders of the empire. But we had nothing remotely like what would be needed for a war of continental proportions. And all that had to really be built on the hoof during those years, 1914 to 1918. And the way it was done just involved just about every branch of industry. And I think that probably changed this country forever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And have you seen any particular stories that you liked, or changes of coming out of the war, of what was then being invented, or what might have changed industry, changed production as their need changed?
Well, I think that there was one going into the war that actually really spins off significantly later. The War Office specified magnetos made by the German company Bosch for British Army vehicles. And of course, as soon as war was declared, that source dried up immediately. Mercifully, there was one British company that made magnetos, and it was bought by Lucas's. And Lucas's then produced all the magnetos needed for the British Army during the war. It gave Lucas's a great leader, and it pushed them into that interwar period really as a stunningly good company. They understood their customers, they understood their products. They weren't particularly proud about having to invent everything themselves. They would very happily take other people's ideas and manufacture them rather better. But coming out of the war, you certainly had, people like Lucas, but the other motor companies, very much geared up for peacetime production.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And did you feel that they just sort of naturally centered around particular parts of the country, this work, or do you think there were other influences? Such as the existing industries or past industries that they were taking on that capacity from?
Well, I think if we look at where a lot of these industries ended up, Coventry, Birmingham in particular. Birmingham has a centuries-old history of working metal. You had in Birmingham workshops carrying out perhaps single processes on what would end up as a metal tool of some sort. So it already had that skill. Coventry too. But then you go down to the other places where they were making motor cars in London. London had a huge variety of different skills and industries, and that's where it was all built up.
But so much of these companies and things, their names have changed or were lost or have been acquired over time. Do you have a fondness for any particular ones of these sort of motor vehicles, or what we might not know named now might have had a smaller start to the world?
Well, I guess I have a huge fondness for so many of these companies. Really, I declare an interest in the Roots Group since after the war my father became a director. So as a child, we always had Humbers and Hillmans. My uncle rallied in sunbeams. I thought they were absolutely gorgeous cars. One of the first films I remember going to see, Dr. No, had James Bond driving a Sunbeam Alpine. These were glorious, beautiful, stunningly lovely cars. But then you've got your Armstrong Sidleys. You've got your Jaguars. A wonderful heritage of Jaguars, gorgeous cars.
I mean, there's definitely a sort of feeling that almost the passion for metalwork or woodwork or craftsmanship transferred over to once these vehicles were more understood how to put them together. There was definite love and passion and craftsmanship in making them, rather than just a mass scale industry of how cheaply can we roll them out.
I think that's right, and it is both a delight and a sadness. The delight, of course, is that you did have beautiful handmade vehicles. The sadness, of course, is that they were too expensive for the market, and there began probably the downfall.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just moving away a little bit from motor vehicles, there's also a lot of innovation around sort of devices or improvements for the home as well. I think you covered so sewing machines and things as being one of the key changes.
Yeah, I think the sewing machine is a wonderful story, because it is actually extremely difficult to replicate with a machine the act of sewing. And it took a long time and a lot of attempts and failures to actually get to a machine that could sew as well as a human being. But eventually it did. And in the process, of course, people got to understand mechanical processes very much better. And it was, built on that understanding that someone like Hillman could start making a bicycle. And of course, there were many others making bicycles from really the first starting point. And the bicycle itself, of course, led into the motor car. But I think, all that understanding of mechanical systems, the sewing machine was very much there at the beginning, but of course the watch as well.
Just being able to own, be more portable with time. There's probably a whole stories in that too. So much is driven from time and being portable with that, and the detail of getting it so small to be had on the wrist. I mean, did you not to try and play on words too much, but did you find yourself pulling threads and connecting people and companies and innovation over this period that you felt like there were some innovations or some pieces that definitely they lined up or they followed each other, but you wouldn't have seen that in advance, sort of thing. You only notice it going backwards.
Oh, I think that's right. I think one of the things I enjoyed most was finding out about some of the entrepreneurs and seeing where they'd learned their trades. And of course, the people making motor cars had started many years earlier, possibly making ships, steam engines, or what have you. So those threads just sort of run all the way through the names, the families, the Napier family. For those of us who love railway locomotives, we will think of the Deltic, made by Napiers. But there were Napiers making ships on the Clyde, a century earlier. Same family name. Same with Stevenson as well. These names, these families, ran all the way through. I think one thing we haven't talked about that I find fascinating is the whole electrical industry. Mentioned earlier the telegraph, but of course soon came the electric motor and of course the electric generator. And once you had electricity, you had the ability to take power to where people were rather than taking people to where the power was. So you have the national grid setting up So electricity can come into people's homes, so it can light the streets. And in the home, of course, it is there to power the wireless. And we've talked about wired communication, but wireless communication is, it is difficult to imagine the world without it. And yet the world without it was very much the case in 1851.
Yeah, I mean, even our concept of, we might think is fairly standard and old, of just radio communication, listening to radio, is not going to have been a wide practice at the start of this period, available. Even more, the innovations of moving pictures and sort of more personal type communication, sort of moving further forward than a telegraph, into telephones and things. That's definitely, it shapes people and what's possible in the business as well.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that continually fascinates me, with some of these innovations like the wireless, a lot of people couldn't see the point. They said, well, we have a perfectly good telegraph. Why on earth do we need a wireless? But people like Marconi, well, not people, it was Marconi, said, well, yes, you're right, unless, of course, you're at sea. And then wired communication doesn't actually work. And so it was putting Marconi wireless on ships that I think really kick-started the whole idea of wireless. If you can imagine a ship carrying a cargo and being in touch with land, it gives huge commercial advantage. And it was that really the shipping industry embraced, as well as, of course, the wealthier passenger who could get on a ship equipped with Marconi wireless, could lift up a telephone in the middle of the Atlantic and speak to someone in South London. This was a marketing advantage for the shipping companies.
Yeah, I had the experience of that. My grandfather was involved in cocoa and sugar and trading of these. Also, was that often, because it took such vast amount of time to move stuff in a container ship, often things would be put on a ship before it was sold and be sold while it was on the ship, while it was on the way. And you can obviously, by having communication with them and asking them to reroute or not reroute, you've got a sense of how far they are away, instead of, well, they should be here next Tuesday or a couple of weeks' time. We'll wait and see when they turn up.
That's right. So the wireless really came into its own then. But, there were other innovations where people couldn't actually see the point. The typewriter, when that was first invented, people thought, well, yeah, nice idea, but no one's actually going to use them. And of course, how wrong they were. The same comes towards, the very end of the period we're talking about with the computer. As you know, with people like Turing, the British were actually in a very, very good position with computers after the Second World War. But the British potential consumer of computers really didn't think they'd catch on. They didn't think there were going to be enough people who would want to use them.
I think there's been moments in history for several of these, haven't there? There's been moments in history of the people not being enamored with the idea of a car, of saying, well, I'll just have a faster horse, and similarly with the computers. I think classically a bit later on, but IBM said, well, the worldwide usage of computers, well, we probably only need about 4 of them in the world, because their concept of them, and obviously that at the time, computers were probably most often being used for things like trajectory planning and things for missiles or for hacking codes. There isn't that much call for that in peacetime, of sort of hacking that same levels of codes and working out trajectories of munitions. So, well, why would we need them? But I guess factories and things could think, well, they could figure some other stuff out with the power of this that might take quite a lot of people to work through.
Yeah, I think one company that really stands out in terms of invention is ICI, which was born after the First World War, was intending to do, en masse, really what had happened before in terms of producing fertilizer, and discovered after the war that actually producing fertilizer was not that difficult, and people would do it for themselves in other countries. So, that business model that I think people thought was going to be an absolute winner just didn't work. Now, ICI had the wisdom to spend each year a not inconsiderable sum on research. And they recruited top scientists and really told them to go and explore. And they went and they explored. And out of their exploration came things like perspex and polythene. And at the time, I guess they looked at this stuff and thought, well, it's all right, but I have no idea what we're going to use it for. And of course, perspex found its way into the cockpits of Spitfires, and polythene turned out to be the perfect insulation material for all the miles of wire that our radar defenses needed. So out of research, can come these great things. And I think if there's any lesson for people to learn today is, for goodness sake, do not give up on research.
Indeed. I mean, that's what I was just going to, as we come to the end of this interview, was that sense of, do you think there was stuff waiting to be discovered? Do you think people wanted that discovery? Was there a demand, or were people just discovering these things and then there was a use found for them? I mean, did you get a sense of which way history is in terms of us then looking forward?
Yeah, to be honest, it is the latter. People discovered something and then found a use for it. There's a lovely quote, and I think it's from a director of ICI to one of their scientists. So, Mr. Scientist, what are you going to invent next? What a classic lack of understanding, of what research is actually about. You never know what you're going to invent.
Indeed, and one usually hopes it's to solve some sort of need, but we do find that often these things get invented as byproducts, or it's an unneeded part of one process that suddenly becomes a very valuable part of a new one.
Absolutely, it's a bigger subject, but if we look at hydrocarbons, it was from the refining of crude oil to produce fuel for motor vehicles, and massive byproducts were just being wasted into the atmosphere until, and it is the Americans said, well, why don't we see if we can use some of this stuff? And of course, the plastics industry came out of that.
Mm-hmm. It's really nice that the way that you've covered in the book, it wasn't just a focus on just sort of the period between the wars, or just the motor vehicle. There's you're covering there's sort of chemical industries and the home and motor vehicles, and the sort of the whole sets of innovation that all lead into one another, which makes it so helpful if someone's trying to research or discover their own sort of thread through this period. So, I mean, we come to the end of the period with the Festival of Britain, which is another showcase, another new piece of what are new possibilities and new ways of trying to drive sort of growth again after people's and countries' recoveries after the Second World War. Do you think that we're in a good position, easy for me to say, to show another leap of 100 years if we're tracking into the year 2051, if another one of these festivals comes around again?
Well, Tristan, I truly wish I did, and in some ways we are. There is, a good deal of British industry that is wonderfully innovative, that is doing extremely interesting stuff. But time and time again, I am seeing, these great companies, small or medium-sized, disappearing into foreign ownership. Now, I don't know whether that's a bad thing, but I'm not convinced it's a good thing. I think a lot of our industry has benefited from being homegrown. We have examples both ways. If we look at the big electrical companies, the AEI and English Electric, they were started with American capital, but then became, in a sense, truly British when they went into GEC. But an awful lot of that has now been dissipated. And again, I don't know how worrying that is.
I mean, do you think that's a sense of a government or business and private equity not having the stomach so much or the interest so much in longer term innovation? Because many of these things had wonderful changes, but I'm sure none of them could really be described as sort of quick things. They weren't things that you were going to make money on next week until there was the opportunity, until there was the right time, and there was enough research and enough perfecting of the product.
No, we are and were terribly short-termist. I think that those guys at ICI in the 20s and 30s couldn't do the same today, or the market would say, no, you can't do it. We need immediate results. And I don't think necessarily things worked like that. And it's a great shame because I think we could do an awful lot better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope and see what the innovation and the new possibilities, the new horizon. I think definitely everyone has a sense of we're almost living in the future that many of those festivals, at least in their artwork and things, imagined of mechanizing and automating and improving. We almost need to find that new horizon, find those new goals to strive towards. I mean, many industries do, but I think probably as a general populace, we're almost content. We've got to the end of that period, and maybe we're just waiting for what is the next period that we're moving through.
Yeah, I think we have so much talent that it needs scope for expression in producing new and interesting things.
I mean, what do you feel then is the or you learnt from here that might be the next challenges for industry to be innovating in the next years, or the lessons to learn from the past?
Well, I honestly think the whole area of energy is one where we can learn from the past. There is, to my mind, absolutely no doubt that Britain was well to the fore with coal and steam, and we were exceptionally good at it. We did have the Flying Scotsman, we had the Mallard, we had ships that covered the world. We were very, very good. Now, when oil came along, we were in a way a bit slow. We were slow moving from steam to diesel on the railways. We were slow moving from steam to diesel in ships. Other things in oil, and particularly gas, we were really good at. With gas taking on Whittle's invention of the jet engine, we produced stunningly impressive gas turbines that powered the oil industry for decades. So all of that, I think we got really, really right. I would like to think we're going to get the transition to green energy right. But whilst we are seriously involved, I don't see too many British manufacturers having their products incorporated into wind farms and what have you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think that's certainly a subject that I'm very much interested in, and we'd like to see for generations coming forward, and for the people working now to be on that. So I think that's a good point to wrap that on. Um, just to come to the end on some more sort of fun or personal questions. Apart from going out and reading and digesting the history and learning back where we've come from and where these inventions and industry has had as a history, of reading your own book, do you have a particular favorite tool, machine, or book that you might like to share with our listeners, that they might also like to try out?
Well, I have two tools that I do adore. I have a brace and bit, which I think was my father's, or it might have been my grandfather's. And it is beautiful and very, very useful. And I often will use that in preference to an electric drill. The other thing I have is a hammer, the head of which is covered in leather. Now, the history of that, I'm fairly certain, is that it was provided or sold to my father by Jaguar when he bought one of the first SS cars known as a Jaguar in the 30s. And of course, it was there to change a wheel. I remember I had one years ago when I had a MG Midget, but that hammer went, but my father's one remained. So those are my two favourite tools.
That's good. I've used a brace and bit, but I've never used a leather clad hammer. Does it work sufficiently? I mean, I can't quite think how is that to be
If you
used?
think about it, it's a mallet. So, instead of having a wooden head, it has a metal head, but with a leather covering to soften it. So, when you're changing the wheel of your car with the wing nut, for want of a better word, that's in the center of the wheel, you can give it a thump with this hammer, but you will not damage it.
Gotcha. Yeah, when you have a priceless vehicle, when you have a treasured thing, you do not want to dent it or tarnish
Right,
it,
absolutely.
just by having to change a wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And our fun closing question is, if you could give either a superhero power to yourself or to one of your readers, for innovating in the future, do you think that there would be something that you would like to be able to reach for as your superpower, to learn from history, or to make the next history?
Gosh. Well, I think it would always relate to what you're actually doing at the time. And I've spent the last few weeks exploring the history of the British and the semiconductor, which is not the prettiest history. But I think it's a history that doesn't necessarily have a sad end. Yes, an awful lot of semiconductors are now produced in Taiwan. But we do produce a lot ourselves because we're very efficient and very good at it. So my superhero power would be to have the wisdom to keep the production of these very clever things in this country.
That's a good one. I like that. And yeah, so thank you very much for being able to join us and walk us through this fascinating period of history and change. If we want to be able to also, the readers want to be able to pick up and be able to read this too, where's the best place to get a copy, or find out more about yourself and your work?
Okay, so in terms of the book, the best place to buy it is actually the Pen and Sword website. It is cheaper there than on Amazon. Quite why, I have no idea, but so that's where I go to buy it. I do have a couple of blogs, and I can send you the addresses for those, and people can actually follow the work I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I mean, just as a point of reference, then, what is it that you reference? Is it just sort of going through the libraries, or are there old document archives, or where is good things that you find to research these topics?
Next week is actually a good example. I'm going down to the National Archives at Kew, and I'm going to dig through files from the early 60s, or early mid 60s. When the Wilson government came in and espoused very much the white heat of technology. And so you have government involved in really some of the very exciting companies of the time, and making all sorts of mistakes. So I think that would be quite interesting.
Is it sometimes fun? The fun stories or the mistakes are as fun to learn about as the innovations and the positive outcomes?
Yeah, yes and no, really, because I am a bit passionate about it, and so that always brings in a sadness when people get things wrong. But sometimes the things they get wrong are quite funny.
Indeed. All right. Well, yeah, it's been great speaking to you, as I said, and we'll look forward to catching up again soon. Thank you very much.
Look forward to it. Thanks very much, Tristan.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us again today on the Cliff Notes podcast. We hope you've enjoyed listening to myself and the guest. If you'd like to find out more about them and review the show notes, please visit cliffnotespodcast.com or reach out to us on Twitter or LinkedIn. That's great, and we'll catch up with you again soon.